Hi everyone, my name's Diabetor, and today we're going to talk about my favorite weapon in Elden Ring, the Flamberge. The Flamberge is a greatsword that scales best with dexterity and has passive bleed buildup on hit. Its greatsword level damage combined with that bleed buildup make it really strong. Since it's a greatsword, it does high base poise damage, making it really effective at breaking enemy stances. It can also accept a wide array of Ashes of War, making it effective against a variety of enemies in any situation. On top of all of that, it also gets a bunch of hyper armor while two-handing, making it really effective for trading hits with smaller enemies. The cherry on top of all of that is that it only has a weight of 10, and with only a 15 strength requirement and 14 dexterity requirement, builds with relatively low physical stats can still make good use of it. The Flamberge is by far my favorite weapon in Elden Ring, so I'm going to show you where to get it and how I like to get the most out of it. The Flamberge is located in Redmane Castle, and with a few shortcuts, you can get to it in about 20 minutes on a new character. The first thing we're going to do is grab a bunch of throwing daggers from Gael at the Church of Elden. After that, we're going to follow the road north into the woods. You'll see this soldier intently staring at a corpse, so kill him and grab the item off the corpse. It's 4 kukris, which we're going to use as a distraction later on. Then, as always, we're going to head to the Gatefront Ruins and talk to Melina so we can use Torrent. In the Gatefront Ruins, there are 2 big carriages. The one closer to the Site of Grace is guarded by a shield guy, so sneak up behind him and bonk him on the back of the head. And inside the chest on the carriage, you'll find the Lordsworn's Greatsword, which we're going to use to kill a couple enemies in a little bit. While you're here, make sure you grab the map of Limgrave, and you're also going to head down into the cellar and grab the Stormstomp Ash of War and the Whetstone Knife. In case you missed it, if you check out the map, this is approximately the spot where the guy is guarding the corpse with the kukris on it. Anyway, there's a couple more items we need to grab before we go to Redmane Castle, so we're going to follow the road west of the Gatefront up to the Stormhill Shack, and from there we're going to run up the hill to this plateau where we're going to grab a crystal tear. Then we're going to go around the north end of the plateau, jump down to the woods, and follow the path down to the Warmaster Shack. From the Stormhill Shack, if you just head northeast, you'll see this plateau with a troll walking around on it. At the end of the plateau, you're going to grab the Strength Knot Crystal Tear. We're going to use this to make sure that we can wield the Lordsworn's Greatsword once we go to Redmane Castle. And then on the north end of the plateau, there's a cliff you can drop down safely to the woods, and you just head south until you get to the Warmaster Shack. In the shack, you'll find Warmaster Bernal, and we need to buy an Ash of War from him. It costs 1,000 runes, so in order to get that really easily, we're going to come to this cliff here just to the southwest of the shack, where there's a graveyard with a bunch of golden runes that we can use to easily get the runes we need. In this graveyard, keep an eye out for the exploding piles of balls. As anyone knows, it's really bad when a pair of balls explodes in your face, so you're going to want to stay clear of them if you can. Anyway, loot the graveyard, and you're going to head back down to the Warmaster Shack. You should have a bunch of golden runes from that. You're going to need to use a bunch of them in order to get 1,000 runes. Here's a pro tip: if you hit use selected number, you can use a bunch of them at once instead of going, one after the other for like 5 golden runes or whatever. Anyway, make sure you have 1,000 runes, talk to your Banal, purchase the Impaling Thrust Ash of War. This is a good attack in general, but we're going to use it specifically because it can penetrate shields, and we're going to need to kill a couple shield guys on our way to Redmane Castle. From the Warmaster Shack, we're going to head to the southeast down to the bridge going into the eastern side of Limgrave. You can also just fast travel back to the Gatefront Ruins if you want, and follow the road to the east, but I went from the Warmaster Shack because it's about the same distance either way. On the bridge, be careful not to fall off and nearly die. There's a smithing stone here you can grab in case you need to upgrade the Lordsworn's Greatsword for when we use it at Fort Gael in a little bit. Once you're across the bridge, you're going to follow the road to the north. You'll see I stopped by the Artist Shack here. I didn't show it in this video, but there's another smithing stone you can grab here in case you want to upgrade the sword more. But anyway, we're following the road to the east into the Mistwood, where we're going to grab a Site of Grace in case we get murdered by some giant bears. And then we're going to grab the map of East Limgrave so that we can see what we're doing. And finally, we're going to follow the road to the north to the Third Church of Marika at the north end of the Mistwood. The shortest route from this Grace to the map is through the Mistwood, and there's like 3 or 4 giant bears along the way, so be careful not to get murdered by them. But anyway, once you grab the map, you're just going to follow the road to the north, and that takes you to the Third Church of Marika, where we're going to grab the Flask of Wondrous Physic. and there's also a sacred tier that you can use to upgrade your flasks. Now that we have the physic, we're going to stop at the Grace. Make sure you put the Impaling Thrust Ash of War on the Greatsword that we picked up. You'll see it has a 16 strength requirement and a 10 dex requirement, so in the Wondrous Physic you can put the Strength Knot Crystal tier, and that increases your strength by 10 for 3 minutes when you drink the physic. And so with that, any class can meet that strength requirement, and it only has a 10 dex requirement, so the class with the lowest starting dex has 9 dex, so it should only take at most 1 point for you to be able to use this thing. From the third church, we're going to head to the northeast into Caelid. The fastest way to do this is to go directly north from the church toward the cliffs that you see, and there's a few spirit springs you can jump up on Torrent that'll take you straight up the cliffs up to the northern road, and then you can head directly east into Caelid. If you look closely at the map, you'll see the second waypoint I'm about to put right here. This is a building called the Shack of the Rotting, which is where we need to go because there's a site of grace there. So you can just jump through the window from the church, head up the hill, and this takes you to the Spirit Springs. There's a bunch of wolves here, but you can just run past them, and then take the second Spirit Spring up. Now you're on the road, and just follow it into Caelid. Grab the Site of Grace at the Rot View balcony. So we need to get to Redmane Castle, and that's all the way at the southeast end of Caelid. So not only is that a dangerous walk, but it's also a pretty long one that I don't feel like doing. So instead, we're going to go to Fort Gael, which I just marked on the map there, and take a shortcut to Redmane Castle. So instead of going all the way through Caelid throughout the road, you can just head directly south from the Site of Grace here, and there's a shortcut that takes you right to Fort Gael. So you see here, just jump over the rock, and boom, now you have a straight shot to Fort Gael. There's 1 or 2 falls in this area, where if you jump off at the wrong spot, you might take damage or die, so just watch your footing, but you should be able to pretty easily just jump down, head straight up to Fort Gael, grab the Site of Grace. Then we're going to follow the cliff towards Fort Gael because we don't want to go up the main road because it's guarded by a bunch of soldiers and stuff. The main threat here is the knight who does this Rain of Arrows attack that follows you. That'll do a ton of damage. You're going to see when it hits me, it's going to almost one-shot me. Fortunately, once you get close enough to the fort, there's a Stake of Marika, so if you die, you'll just respawn at the fort. But, you know, try not to get hit by that Rain of Arrows if you can avoid it. Here, I forgot to sit at a Grace and refill my Flask of Wondrous Physic, so I jumped off the cliff to die and respawn at the Stake of Marika, but as you saw from the icon there, the Stake of Marika won't let you respawn at it if you jump off the cliff, so don't fall off the cliff. Anyway, be careful with the Rain of Arrows. This guy will detect you and he'll just keep shooting arrows at you for like 30 seconds, so just before you climb up the ladder and get stuck in place, so you get murdered by the arrows, make sure that he's lost aggro on you and isn't shooting at you anymore. Inside the fort, be careful not to fall into the lion pit. You can backstab this guy and kick him off into the pit. There's a ladder in case you fall down there. You can use it to climb back up. The NPC soldiers here cannot climb up that ladder to get back up to you, so if you get any of them to fall down there, then they're not a threat to you anymore. So in this fort, we're going to need the kukris, and we're also going to need the throwing daggers. Make sure you have those equipped on your quick item slots. You're also going to want your Wondrous Physic with the Strength Knot Crystal tier, so that we can use the Greatsword effectively. Once we go up these stairs, there's a few soldiers, so you're going to want to sneak up it. So there's one guy by the wall right here. We need to get into the tower and climb to the top of it. There's a knight inside the tower, and there's a third guy over here. So we're going to lure these 2 small guys out one by one, and then we're going to run past the knight. So drink your Wondrous Physic. Then you can throw a throwing dagger at this guy, but it might aggro the second one, so I like to just walk up to him and let him spot me, and that way he follows me over here. Run back down the steps back to this platform. He might get stuck on a wall, just be patient with him, he's a little slow like that. But anyway, as he's coming at you, you can just hit him with Impaling Thrust, it'll go through his shield and should break his poise, and then hit him with the riposte, and he's dead. And so we're going to repeat that process for the second guy. I hit him with the throwing dagger to draw his aggro, because I don't want to walk up behind him. Once you go close enough to the tower, the knight will walk out of it, and if he spots you, it's going to be really inconvenient. So you want to lure this guy away with the throwing dagger, just to make sure that the knight won't come out and spot you. Anyway, walk up until you hear the knight walking out, and you can throw a kukri at the low wall over there to draw his attention to it. There's also a chest over here that has a talisman in it to increase your strength by 5. I didn't grab it because I didn't need it. You might get spotted by the knight if you go to grab it, so be careful of that. But, you know, if you die, you just respawn at the Stake of Marika anyway, so it's not a huge deal. But anyway, while the knight is distracted, you can run past him, climb up the ladder, and take the teleporter over to Redmane Castle. Now, you're in a heavily fortified area, and as soon as you move, there's a ballista up there that'll spot you and attack you. It only starts attacking once you move, so if you need to prepare yourself, don't move until you've finished healing or whatever. Anyway, so you see we took a significant shortcut down to Redmane Castle. We're going to get on Torrent and immediately run off to the left to make sure we don't get hit by that ballista. It takes him a second to fire at you, but he will spot you as soon as you start moving, so be careful of that. The road past this little cliff is guarded by a big ballista, and if you come out, it's going to start shooting bolts at you. So instead, you should jump up on top of this cliff, and now you're in a position where this ballista can't turn far enough to actually spot you, so you're 100% safe. Run past it and all the bad guys, and then you can't go through the main gate, so we have to come around the side here, jump down to the siege tower, and then down to the lower cliff. And we're going to follow the cliffs around behind the castle. Be careful of the bats. And be really careful of this fall here that always kills me. Be careful of that. Make sure you jump over it. Now, in this graveyard, there's a couple bats that'll kick your ass because they're pretty tough. There's also one of the female singing ones there. But this scarab drops the Flaming Strike Ash of War, which is really good. Also, you're going to see there's a door here. This is locked from this side. You have to climb up the ladder to get into the castle. But yeah, so if you kill the scarab, it gives you Flaming Strike, which is a very, very good Ash of War, but you might end up aggroing the bats in the process. So I actually don't recommend killing that scarab until you've grabbed the Site of Grace inside the castle, because if you die, you're going to respawn all the way back at the Fort Gael Site of Grace right now. So definitely be careful around the bats. Anyway, climb up the ladder, sneak past the bad guys. You're going to come over to the east here, onto this battlement. There's one soldier here. He shouldn't be too hard to kill if you get the drop on him. If you decide to go across the way here, on top of this building, that knight will kick your ass, so be careful not to get too close to him. Anyway, we need to go into this door with the two candles to go up to where the Flamberge is. But you see there's a mad pumpkinhead guarding it, and I don't want to take the risk of dying, because like I mentioned before, there's no Stake of Marika here, and the last grace we touched is the one at Fort Gael, so if we die, we have to come all the way back here, and that's going to suck. So instead of taking the risk with the Pumpkinhead, we're going to head into this doorway over here. You can't really see the doorway from here, but there's a door there. We're going to head all the way across the courtyard through that doorway, where there is a small room with a Site of Grace in it. So there's a bunch of soldiers here with flamethrowers guarding it, but you see there's a delay. Like, they fire once, and then there's like 2 or 3 seconds where they have to reload. They can't fire. So you can just wait for them to stop firing. And you see there's openings in between them where there's like this safe spot where you can stand next to them. So it shouldn't be too hard to get past these guys without dying. And then once you touch the Grace, now this is set to your spawn point. So even if you die here before resting at the Grace, you'll respawn at that Site of Grace. Now it is safe to explore Redmane Castle, which includes coming up this ladder and grabbing the Flamberge from behind the Pumpkinhead. He's pretty slow, but like I said, it's not worth the risk of having to run all the way back from Fort Gael. Anyway, there's also a Smithing Stone 3 up here, and if you go up the little tower, there's a Smithing Stone 5, which you can use to upgrade it later on. And now that I've shown you how to get the Flamberge, we're going to go over its stats and requirements, and then I'll talk about my preferred infusions and Ashes of War. The Flamberge has a weight of 10 and requires 15 strength and 14 dexterity to wield. It gets a D in strength scaling and a C in dex scaling. That C goes up to a B at plus 25, so it's primarily a dex weapon. It also has a passive 55 bleed buildup. Being that it's a greatsword, it does 5.5 base poise damage. I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a bit, but suffice it to say that this thing does a ton of poise damage and is great at breaking stances. Here I'm going to compare the damage it does based on different infusions and leveling up different stats with both a plus 0 Flamberge and a plus 25 Flamberge. As a reference point, I'm using a level 60 character with the minimum requirements of 15 strength and 14 dex. We're going to put 40 points into either stat. If you look at the attack power section in the center of the screen, you'll see that I have the plus 0 Flamberge equipped as Right Armament 1, and I have the plus 25 Flamberge equipped as left armament 1. Currently, I'm leveling up my character while both Flamberges have the standard infusion. It only gets a D in strength scaling, so every point that I put into dexterity is worth a lot more damage than any point that I put into strength. After putting 40 points into dex, the plus 25 Flamberge had an attack power of 540. Compare that to when I put 40 points into strength and only brought it up to an attack power of 458. Now I'm going to switch both swords over to the heavy infusion, which gets rid of all dex scaling and makes them scale significantly more with strength. You'll see the plus 25 Flamberge has a B scaling in strength. That's up a lot from the D scaling it had before, so now every point that you put into strength is worth a lot more, bringing its attack power up to 582 after investing 40 points into strength. You'll also see that when I put points into dex, it doesn't affect their damage at all, because like I said, it got rid of all dex scaling. However, the Flamberge gets higher base dexterity scaling than it does for strength scaling, and infusions actually work as a multiplier on a hidden number that you can't see. What that means is that when I put the keen infusion on it, it gets even more dex scaling than it got from strength scaling with the heavy infusion. So now with the keen infusion, it has an A in dex scaling and only an E in strength scaling. So the strength points barely do anything at all, but when I put points into dex, the damage goes up to 598, which is even more than those points into strength were worth with the heavy infusion. It's only a difference of a few points, but at higher levels of dexterity, it'll significantly outclass the heavy one. Now we're going to look at the Lightning Infusion. I chose Lightning specifically because it sacrifices a bunch of strength scaling, but it only sacrifices a little bit of dex scaling. In addition, the lightning damage scales directly with your dex. So the Lightning Infusion is the best choice if you want to run an Elemental Infusion on this weapon. On the plus 25 Flamberge, I have a C scaling in dex and an E scaling in strength. With only an E for strength scaling, you'll see that putting 40 points into the strength stat hardly does anything for this weapon's damage at all with the Lightning Infusion. On the other hand, putting points into dex is going to bring up this attack power by a ton. Now, this attack power can be misleading. For the sake of brevity, I'm putting this down in the description. Feel free to read it if you want to learn about split damage. But essentially, an enemy's defense stat will make that 693 attack power be worth a lot less in practice. Finally, we're going to talk about my favorite infusion, which is the Occult Infusion. The Occult Infusion significantly reduces strength and dex scaling, but adds a bunch of arcane scaling. This means that the vast majority of the damage the weapon will do comes from your arcane stat, but because bleed buildup scales with arcane, this also means that the Flamberge's passive bleed buildup will also increase with your arcane stat. Now, it won't increase the bleed buildup as much as the blood infusion does, but the Occult Infusion gets significantly better damage than the blood infusion. I love the Occult Infusion because it makes it like the perfect middle ground between doing a ton of physical damage while also still doing a ton of bleed buildup, which you're going to see after I level up my stats and choose the Occult Infusion with the 40 points invested into Arcane. So because we have an E in both Dex and Strength scaling, putting points into those stats is hardly going to increase the damage of the Flamberge at all with the Occult Infusion. Putting 40 points into Dex only brought me up to 416 attack power. And since the Flamberge's Strength scaling was low to begin with, putting 40 points into Strength doesn't even bring it up to 400. On the other hand, if we put 40 points into Arcane, we're going to get a ton of damage out of it. It won't be as much as the Keen Infusion did with points put into Dexterity, but it's still pretty high. It even outclasses the Standard Infusion by about 20 or so points. Now that I've leveled up my Arcane, if we go back and look at the stats, you'll see that the status buildup is significantly higher for the Poison, Blood, and Occult Infusions. The Blood Infusion is doing over 130 bleed buildup on hit, which is pretty high, but the Occult Infusion does over 100 bleed buildup, which is still really high, and gets like 30% more damage, so it's clearly the better choice. Overall, while the Keen Infusion and the Lightning Infusion are both good on a Dex build, my favorite is definitely the Occult Infusion on an Arcane build. Now that we've gone over the different infusions that are effective on the Flamberge, let's talk about my favorite Ashes of War. While there are many others that you can actually put on this thing, my preferred ones are Stormblade, Wild Strikes, Cragblade, and most of all Piercing Fang. If you don't have access to Piercing Fang, I also recommend Impaling Thrust, which is like a downgraded version of it. First up is Stormblade. You can purchase this from Warmaster Bernal at the Warmaster Shack. Stormblade can be used on daggers and on any kind of sword smaller than a colossal sword. It's very easy to obtain, it has a low FP cost, a low stamina cost, it attacks fast, it has fast startup animation, fast recovery animation, and it gets great damage, especially if you combine it with something like the Shard of Alexander, like I'm using in this clip. It gets decent range, which makes it great for attacking enemies that are attacking you from a distance, like the archer you saw in the previous clip, and also against enemies rushing at you, like guys on horses, or in this case, guys with spears and shields. It also gets good stamina damage, which is why in this case, it allowed me to pretty easily break this guy's block, especially while he was approaching me. And I just want to point out here real quick, you check out this hyper armor on the Greatsword Charge R2, I love it. It's amazing, I love hyper armor on this thing. But yeah, so Stormblade is very, very strong, and it's also really effective when you're using it at point-blank range, so that you're hitting the enemy with both the projectile and the actual swings of the sword. While it's good against big guys and against bosses, it excels against smaller enemies, who are weak enough that you can pick them off in only 1 or 2 hits, so you can use it to attack them and thin out a group if a bunch of enemies are coming at you at once. It's also really good for softening up bigger guys as they come at you, so that their health and poise are reduced by the time you actually get into melee range of them. Overall, Stormblade is a great Ash of War. Up next is Wild Strikes. You can get Wild Strikes by killing a scarab just outside the entrance to Stormvale Castle. Wild Strikes essentially turns you into a tanky, slow-moving blender that will shred anything in front of you. This especially excels when you have a weapon that does status effect buildup. You see here, I'm easily proccing bleeds on these guys, even though they're already dead by the time I proc the bleed. Wild Strikes also has a special attack that you can do by pressing R1 or R2, which does a ton of poise damage. My favorite thing about Wild Strikes is the hyper armor it gives you, which allows you to tank enemy attacks so you can just keep fucking wailing on them, while they desperately try to stop you like you're the Juggernaut or something. Now, it isn't infinite hyper armor, there is a limit to it, but it is a lot of hyper armor. Here I only have 35 poise for my armor, and I tanked 2 hits from a curved greatsword, so that's pretty good. It's not as great against bosses because they typically won't be stunned by your hits like regular smaller enemies do. However, that special R2 attack does 600% of the weapon's base poise damage. So in the case of the Greatsword, which has a 5.5 base poise damage, that R2 will do 33 poise damage. Speaking of poise, that's a great segue to talk about Cragblade. Cragblade can be acquired by killing the scarab near the sword monument to the west of Redmane Castle. Cragblade can be used on any class of weapon except for whips. It's a weapon buff that only applies to the weapon that Cragblade is equipped on, and the buff lasts for 60 seconds and increases physical damage by 20% and poise damage by 10%. So without Cragblade, that hit did 124 damage, and now with it, it's going to do 157 damage. That physical damage increase does not apply to elemental damage, so if you have a fire infusion, only the physical portion of your damage is going to be buffed by it. That damage increase is nice, but what I really like is the poise damage increase. Using Cragblade and two-handing the Flamberge, it'll do nearly 40 poise damage on a charged heavy attack. It'll also do about 14.5 poise damage on a two-handed R1. What this means is that it'll be significantly easier to get stance breaks on enemies, which is one of the major reasons to use a Greatsword in the first place. Finally, my favorite Ash of War to use on the Flamberge is Piercing Fang. You can also get Impaling Thrust instead. Piercing Fang can be acquired by completing Yora's questline. When you get his Nagakiba, you can take it off in the Ashes of War menu and apply it to other weapons. Its weaker brother, Impaling Thrust, can be bought from Warmaster Bernal at the Warmaster Shack, like we did in the beginning of this video. Piercing Fang has a pretty high FP cost and a pretty high stamina cost, but it gets a ton of range. It can pierce enemy shields, like you saw when I was killing those shield guys a second ago, and because it gets a 600% multiplier to the weapon's base poise damage, on a Greatsword it'll do 33 poise damage on hit. Combined with its fast speed and long range, it is one of the best poise breaking options in the entire game. It'll generally kill smaller enemies before it can break their poise, and against bosses, it's a great tool for stance breaking them so you can kick their ass with critical hits. There are only about 5 or 6 enemies in the game that have more than 120 poise, so pretty much any boss will have its stance broken in only 4 hits. This really is your tool of choice if you want to be a poise-breaking machine. Just get fan daggers or throwing daggers, so that when an enemy moves away from you, you can throw a dagger at them and make sure that their poise doesn't start regenerating. And if you want to take it even further, you can put the Briar armor on so that your rolls will also stop their poise from regenerating. Like I said, if you don't have access to Piercing Fang, you can also get Impaling Thrust, which is its weaker little brother. Impaling Thrust does the same poise damage, but it doesn't do quite as much damage, it doesn't go through shields quite as well, and its tracking is notably worse. You'll see here that I do a few Impaling Thrusts and miss, because my character can't rotate far enough to actually hit the boss, versus now when I'm using Piercing Fang, my character will easily rotate 180 degrees from any angle I'm facing and turn to hit the boss with it. Fang also gets better range than Impaling Thrust, but like I said, if you can't get Piercing Fang because you haven't done Yura's quest, or if you can't afford the FP cost, Impaling Thrust is also a great option. Now that I've talked at length about how much I enjoy using the Flamberge in this game, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Please leave a like and consider subscribing. Leave any feedback or questions you have in the comment section down below. This video took me a lot longer to make than I meant for it to. It's been like 2 or 3 weeks since my last upload. I just kept procrastinating and getting caught up with other stuff that I had to do, but I'm hoping to get more videos out before the end of the month. Anyway, with all that said, I'll catch you later.